We're going to really be driven by your questions today, but figured we'd kick off and just kind of introduce ourselves. Corey and I are colleagues and friends. I work at AWS as a principal security architect. I joined a little over 2 years ago, coming from US government security work. So looking at, the landscape view of security and how to raise the water level. And I see a lot of relationship between the work that I do advising, large enterprises about security and the work that I was doing at the landscape level on behalf of the American people. I think for both of us, these issues are a passion project as well as being our job. We are, like I said, we're available on Twitter for your snark or to participate with ours. And then I've also included an email address here if folks are interested in talking about jobs or, other conversations that make sense to bring to me directly. Feel free to send me an email at merrittbaer@amazon.com. Corey, do you want to do a quick intro for yourself?
Sure. In addition to the boring stuff of fixing companies' horrifying AWS bills, I also run a newsletter, Last Week in AWS, that has a couple of podcasts attendant with it, where I gather all of the news from Amazon's cloud ecosystem, throw out the things I don't find personally interesting, take what's left, and then gently and lovingly make fun of it. It's sort of half a passion project, half an expression of my deep-seated personality problems. But the reason we're here today is to talk about the joyous blend of security and economics, two things that A, no one generally cares about, but that's sort of the point, because B, they care about them a lot right after they really should have been caring about it. There are differences, obviously, between them, but neither one is generally a strategic priority until you're rushing to assure people after the fact just how much of a strategic priority it is and has always been.
Yeah. I don't
want to outrun the slide deck, so please, by all means.
No, there is no agenda here. So sure, go forth with it. I think, one of the questions that came to me on Twitter to ask you was, how do you calibrate the right amount of spend towards security? There will always be some kind of potential for a fire to go out, or to go happen, and then at the same time, without losing sight of your kind of business proposition here, how do you advise customers to think about budgeting for security?
It's a continuum, like almost anything else. It's easy to say, oh, all the money should go to this, but it's just similarly the way that security is a spectrum between ultimate security and usability. At some point, you actually have to get the job done. So it comes down to, like almost anything else, making sure that you effectively wind up baking that into your estimates in the beginning. Understand what the security risks are. Understand as well, in a time of cloud, I'm sure that we've had these conversations ad nauseum to the point where people can almost recite them back to us, but the idea of the shared responsibility model, understand what's your responsibility in a place of a cloud provider, great. There are other budgets you can tap as you wind up looking at the security story as well. If you take a look at it from a certain point of view, there's an argument that cost and security have the same problem in that there's a complete lack of visibility into what's going on in an environment. And that's a key point of alignment, where when you see the old idea of you can't exploit something that isn't running or installed, usually, that tends to have a bit of a truism to it. Similarly, in the cloud, you don't get billed for what you're using so much as you're getting billed for what you forgot to turn off in the first place. So understanding what's running in your environment is definitely aligned there. As far as what is the right amount of money to budget for this, that becomes a nuanced and difficult conversation for an awful lot of folks, because in a corporate context, everyone tends to have their own agenda or perceived agenda. With bias is a creeping monster that tends to really demonstrate in many respects how companies are incentivized. If you tend to be a company in the regulated space, for example, which is an easy gimme, or the financial or insurance space, a lot of your philosophy is going to be centered around this idea of risk mitigation, risk avoidance. At that point, you can hurl money at the white elephant of avoiding anything that looks like a security breach, to the point where people are effectively unable to functionally do their jobs because of all the approvals they need to do. Conversely, if you're running Twitter for pets and, well, we don't really care that much about security, we're going to move super fast until it realizes that, oops, it turns out that passwords on databases are in fact a best practice. Most companies find themselves somewhere in between. And like anything else, there are going to be inherent trade-offs. This is further exacerbated by the idea that you're not going to be able to cost optimize your way to your next business milestone in the same way that you're not going to be able to increase security to get to your next business milestone. It's a trailing function. It is always on some level in the business going to take something of a back seat on either axis to feature development, improve velocity, improving time to market.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in there, but so I used to give a talk called Build a Machine that was sort of trying to operationalize how to grow up your security in the cloud. And I think the one of the mechanisms, can be to finding mechanisms, but one of the mechanisms that I always advise is to have those conversations about executive buy-in early. So be able to figure out, make them aware that there is going to be a budget for security, and that there's going to be a posture that's inherent in the technology decisions that you make. So if you're going to kill non-compliant architectures, your devs are going to get mad. If you're going to allow a lot of freedom, then your devs will be happy, but you may, like you said, be Twitter for pets, maybe more happy about that. At Amazon, for example, we leave things very open and allow devs to go pretty freely. However, we've got, sandbox environments, and we also just expect that non-compliant architectures, they don't necessarily get killed, but they raise a flag. And so 20 minutes later, your manager gets a ping, and 20 minutes after that, it goes up the chain. So people quickly learn that they are going, one, execs learn that they're going to answer the phone for security. And two, individuals learn that it doesn't matter whose fault it is, but they're going to get escalated. And so I think that creating kind of a cultural expectation there, and getting executives to buy in before there is an incident or before there is a need for some kind of after the fact decision is a way to kind of line up and make sure that you're building trust with your org, and not having the security team be the no people, but just having it be part of the fabric of what you do and how you expect to operate.
Yeah, this tends to tie into what I like to term data center thinking, where people try to effectively not just port their environments and their architectures, but also their entire processes. Where if back in your data center days, there was a 6-week approval process to get a virtual machine up and running somewhere, because you had to get the equipment requisitioned and the approvals and the sign-off and the security stuff and the budget approvals. Well, now we can optimize that in cloud, so it's only 4 weeks of approval to wind up getting something spun up. The problem that you see is that developers are going to ping you every 10 minutes until something gets provisioned, because they want the thing that is blocking them from doing their jobs. Once they've done that thing, and the idea is, oh, now they're going to reach out to turn it off. First, no, they're not. No one ever reaches out to turn something off. Secondly, they will actively do things like run folding at home on these nonsenses, or, let's be honest here, Bitcoin mining, because it keeps the utilization high and keeps these things from being reclaimed. And that is a logical thing to do in that context, because otherwise, what are you going to do? Wait another 4 weeks to spin that cluster up again? You don't want to go through that a second time. You want to get your job done. So making the process lightweight, nimble, and getting away from locking people into these old models is critical. But a lot of times people just view the cloud as being someone else's data center. And sure, you can run it that way. It's just expensive, obnoxious, arguably more insecure, because no one fully understands where things start and stop. And it just leads to unpleasant outcomes across the board. The cloud's a capability story way more than it ever has been a cost savings one.
Yeah, I like that. Okay. This teased me up for something that I wanted to draw folks to, just if they hadn't seen this yet. to the point where cloud is not just someone else's data center, it is a capability story. One of the things that customers, I would say across the board, but especially those in small, medium businesses, are unlikely to have is their own threat intel team. So we just recently released a threat landscape report, which is kind of a cool...
Can you put big in for full screen? People are asking to see it.
Yeah.
Asking for a me, too, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, let me see. I hate how when you go into slideshow, it starts timing you, and we are not going to go through quickly, so, but we'll just deal with it, I guess. So this is a report that comes from the threat intel that we curate, and this is from the AWS WAF managed rules team. So when we are trying to ensure that we have good insights into what domains customers should not trust, that comes from our own threat intelligence, and this is the sharing of that report. So just kind of wanted to draw this for folks who haven't seen it yet and are interested. Here's a couple insights, but you can see the whole report if you look it up or you go to that web address. So, one of the, I think there's a couple sort of, I think that for me, at least, as you mentioned, there's kind of this overarching value proposition that is cloud, which actually usually is driven by their generative, the ability to run on the business side. That being said, no one's going to do anything in cloud unless they believe they can be secure. So from a security perspective, the way that I think about the value add is often sort of in two large categories. The first is the way that it allows you to do stuff that you may have been doing before, but in new ways. So things like logging and monitoring and other forms of, the security controls, preventive, detective, and remediative, especially the remediative, which gives you the ability to automate more. And the second category is this kind of transformative stuff. So the fact that AWS has their Nitro architecture underpinning it, so you've got custom hardware where you no longer have supply chain concerns, or some of the managed services, the ability to do something like AWS Bracket, which is quantum computing managed service, or SageMaker, which is our AI ML, the ability to just like pull things out of a box that allows you to do more from both a generative and a security perspective. So I wanted to draw that attention. These are kind of the tenets that I have been thinking in terms of both security and economic.
There are aspects in which the cloud is provably more secure. Good luck stealing a hard drive from US East 1 versus from a typical company's data center. There's no contest. Other things, yeah, I think the configuration is absolutely where people wind up getting into trouble. We see the same thing with cost too. Right now there are approximately, I'm sure someone on the speaking team has the right number, but there's something on the ballpark of 200 products and services, which means we've now long since passed a point where I can talk incredibly convincingly about AWS services that don't really exist and not be called out on that by AWS employees, because who in the world would keep all of that stuffed into their head? The problem is that if you don't understand what a service is or whether it exists, it becomes very challenging to understand what the security impact of that service is. Some, for example, EC2, running virtual instances or virtual machines as a service, has a nearly boundless series of security problems. Other things have very limited scope. Route 53, some might say it's AWS's hosted DNS service. I consider it the best database ever. It's a managed service. It has a very limited set of things it will accept in return. The security perimeter of something like that or the security scope of something like that is vastly reduced. This all comes back to the idea of understanding what's running inside of your environment. And for better or worse, the only place to get a holistic view of every service that you're using is the bill.
Yeah, that is the only service that everyone must use, except for, I guess, IAM.
You can do an awful lot of stuff just with the root account.
So
please don't ask me how I know that.
Yeah, please don't do a lot of stuff with your root account. Okay. Let's see. I don't know.
Corey,
Where to
this
put
is
this up again.
Corey, just one of the questions that came about since you're talking about root accounts, Ton was questioning how do you go about rotating root account passwords in AWS? Do you have any insights on that since you were talking about that, or is it not possible?
I do, but Merritt, that's your area. I'll let you take it.
You should put 2FA on your root credential and then put it away. Maybe even throw it away. You can always just put it, there's only something like 6 actions that you need to take at this point that you need root to be able to authorize. So I recommend that you either, use whatever is reasonable and state of the art for 2FA. So some folks put an iPhone in a locker and other folks use other, but like be aware that things that have a battery, or have a battery. But ultimately, you can put virtual MFA on it and literally just ditch it because it's so powerful that you really don't want your folks getting access to it. And you can also put human level policies around access, like 2 people must sign off on it, on the ability to access, for example. But, then you're less likely to be able to go grab it in a break glass scenario that you think that you really need it. So really, you're going to ultimately put in a trouble ticket with AWS security. And if you need one of those 6 actions, which, by the way, we are whittling down every year, we try to make it fewer and fewer and kind of move past.
Those things include options like changing the support plan. These are not common day-to-day activities.
Right. These are not, and they're rarely like crisis activities. They're admin activities that, so, I mean, my advice is there's no such thing as rotating your root, and don't touch it unless you really need it. So make sure that people aren't touching it accidentally.
I'm going to take it a step further and say that I understand that there are compliance requirements around this. That said, I've never found value in rotating of credentials in an AWS context, specifically from a basis of they've done studies on this, where if you check a credential set into GitHub or GitHub, depending upon pronunciation choice, how long it takes between that hitting the public repository and starting to be exploited is something on the order of 20 seconds. It winds up, if you're not going to have any password rotation policy that will protect you from this, and not for nothing, in almost every case, when credentials are leaked publicly, you'll know. And depressing as it is to keep saying this, the way you're going to find out in most cases is the bill. It's always interesting when I'm doing a cost analysis and it turns into an impromptu security exercise. So tell me about the instances you're running in Australia. Oh, we don't have anything running there. I believe you are being sincere when you say that. However, and then you show people this, and yay, now we're practicing their security incident response policy.
Yeah, interesting. That's kind of dark. Yeah, I mean, I guess this is a good time to talk about kind of the difference between perceptions of control in cloud and then the reality of what is actually behaviorally more secure. So customers sometimes want to do a customer managed key or, have their own HSM. You can do that. But based on actual human behaviors, we know that it is more secure to have AWS manage it through KMS, our key management system. So it's actually, it's up to you if you have some compliance reason or something that, you're culturally bound to the idea of maintaining your own keys. But ultimately, one of the most secure thing you can do in practice is to have AWS manage them. So I think the idea even of quote unquote rotating root, is it even a password? You shouldn't think of it in that sense. And so I think that if you are getting that request from your enterprise, you should push back. Feel free to send me an email. I will have a conversation with them about, defining what quote unquote root is. And the idea of it being a password that is in need of rotation is just not quite accurate. I saw someone ask about those 6 actions. Corey, did you Google them and send them to him?
I did indeed, and threw the link into the chat. Perfect.
So there you go. You can, if you're curious about what those 6 actions are, you can Google it, or you can look at the chat. Corey put it in there. So this is Kind of cool. I didn't know we would be talking about that. This is always the good thing about live questions.
It looks like there's more than 6, but some of them are patently ridiculous. Like, we should sign up for GovCloud. Yeah, that seems like a common thing people are going to be doing. Registering as a seller in the reserved instance marketplace. Close your account. That's one that I wish more people would do. But sadly, we tend to live in a space where people want to continue dragging out the inevitable. Twitter for pets, I'm staring at you.
All right, let's leave Root for now, unless people have questions. And if you do, then write them in the Q&A. So here where I was just like brainstorming some things that I think are, so Corey, I would imagine that you see some anecdotes that are, stories that might be around anti-patterns and let's say call it worst practices. I spend most of my time not focused on the worst things, but focused on, how to get folks up to a higher level. And so I'm thinking through, what some of the best practices are that have tail lines in both security and billing. So, some of these are just the unsexy work of making sure you know what you have and that you have, so for example, and this is true, I think, in on-prem and cloud, but is one of the value adds of cloud is that you can't have that rogue server, is the ability to then enact decisions around those. But the way to do a good inventory and then to have a coherent way to enact changes to your permissions and your assets is to have a good tagging strategy set up. And even if it's not perfect, do it today, because you can always retag. This is not like ARNs where you can't rename. These are rewritable. You can have whatever universe of tags that you, within reason, that you want to deploy, and you can write over them. And so you could tag with things like a compliance regime, or you could tag with things like the billing code for this developer team or whatever. You could pull those in terms of how the business operates or the kinds of security considerations around sets of data or whatever. And you can deploy them just about immediately. I mean, it takes the time of an API call. This is one element that, folks associate it with billing, but actually, as Corey mentioned earlier, often billing can be actually the kind of indicator of health in security. So it can be a way for you to get arms around your decision making and be able to enact those in a coherent way.
Something to consider as well is that the billing system works on what appears from the outside to be roughly an 8-hour consistency model, which means that you can do a thing in your account, but it will not show up on a bill till in all likelihood the following day. So be aware that that is not real time. One aspect of tagging that I think gets short shrift is that for the longest time, it was this piece of metadata you could attach to some resources, not all, though the coverage is generally enhanced to the point where most things are covered now. And that would just be something you could use for organization purposes. And yes, there were ways you could allocate billing based upon those tags. Relatively recently, tag-based access control became a thing, where in your security policies, things with a certain tag can now be subject to that particular role or user's ability to change them. Now, this is all well and good with the minor side effect of this thing that used to just have billing consequences. So we would spread tagging permissions throughout the organization of, oh, go ahead and tag your stuff, tag your stuff. Spoiler, no one's going to tag you their stuff. You have to have something automatic that does it because people never will. But now all of those things that were granted tag permissions now have potential security implications. So once you start switching over to tag-based security models, understand that this does change what other things are scoped to be able to do. Plan accordingly. Do an audit before enabling something like that on the important things. And again, this is security 101 style stuff. And understand what's going on in the environment. But the realistic truth of the matter is that no one has it all in their head. No one person understands every nuance of cloud security across the board. We're all learning as we go, often by counterexample, often by following worst practices and seeing what happens. One of my recurring horrifying jokes has been, great, when I don't know how to configure an AWS service, I just give a key pair access to configure that service and then post it publicly on the internet. And then I wait and see what the attackers do to configure that service. And once I see something that works, cool. Then I go ahead and apply that to other things. People want to laugh, but they're also terrified that I'm serious. I like that moment.
Yeah,
that tension hanging in the airs.
Yeah, that double edge of snark and sincerity that is your currency. Yeah, yeah. I think that the tagging conversation also for me is just one of those that is typical of security, where I think folks who are not currently, don't have security in their title, perceive that it might be something kind of intimidating, and in fact, it's a lot of unsexy getting your awareness right and putting in thresholds ahead of time so that you don't have to make human decisions every level. And these are things that are not the kind of stuff that they make movies about, but just keeping your kind of house in order and putting in mechanisms so that you have these conversations with your leadership, with dev teams, getting that understanding of sort of where you're going to spend time, considering security to be a process-driven endeavor, where you're never going to say, okay, we've gotten there. It's just always going to be a conversation, a process, and that's kind of unsettling, I think, for some folks, but that is the reality, and to my mind, that's one of the reasons that we need diverse development teams and diverse security teams and folks who think differently and solve problems differently, and think through the ways that technologies might be used or misused, why that is such a high stakes in technology and in cloud. So this is my part where I will give a plug for people who feel like they are interested in security but never felt like they were a security person, or people who think differently and look different or feel like they just never really fit the mold. Like, great, that is that's an asset to have in an organization, to have a mix of styles. And this isn't just the economic kind of trope that if you don't hire X category of people, then you're missing out on 50%, or you're missing out on whatever. Like, the reality is that we know that people who go through the world with different experiences then code differently, they approach problems differently, they see the world differently. And I think that it's not something you boil down to percentages. It is more human and nebulous than that. So that's my usual plug. I gave my email at the beginning, but feel free to send me a note on Twitter or send me an email. Here's some other trends. Corey, do you want to talk about any of these other ones, or do you want me to pull up another question from audience?
We'll go with the audience questions for now. As much fun as working from a slide deck is, the whole point of having these freewheeling interactive conversations so people can chime in with their opinions.
All right. So next question is, hybrid was one of the topics for today by background. What are, how do you approach cost management if you are using a hybrid model? Do you lose out on, gains if you are kind of splitting your assets?
People aren't going to like this part of the story, but all right. I'm here to say the uncomfortable things. In many cases, I see what hybrid is improving your data center at the expense of cloud. You can treat the cloud as just another pile of data centers, by which I mean the only real cloud services you use, by and large, are a bunch of EC2 instances and maybe an object store. Because everything you're building, you want to be able to run in your on-premise environment too. You can do that. But if you start digging into what people are using these things for, these are not dynamic fleets. They require a lot of manual configuration to spin up. So we're not even seeing the elasticity benefits. at that point, it becomes a straight one-to-one cost comparison. And spoiler, if you already spent the money on a data center, it's usually less expensive to run a virtual machine there than it is in a fully managed hosted cloud environment. So people aren't really getting the benefits of the cloud, but they get to say that they're using the cloud. Like anything, it's a spectrum. Very few things in this world are binary decisions. But seeing people move toward a more cloud native style of environment is one of those areas that I think leads to dividends across the board. One of the things I've been against for a long time is this ridiculous idea of multi-cloud, which is the idea of, oh, we're going to build a thing to seamlessly run on multiple providers all at the same time. Great. Good for you. The problem is that you're limited to the exact equivalent services between providers, which isn't that long of a list, in favor of being able to theoretically deploy to a different provider on a whim, except you never do it. It's like a DR plan where you have this theoretical thing that you do that only works when you have to test it, and even then it's painful. As soon as the next change goes out after the DR test, your plan becomes invalidated, doesn't work again, and we see this pattern emerging again and again. I don't personally care what cloud provider you folks pick. Now, you Amazon folks probably have an opinion on this. I don't. Pick a provider, go all in, and you're going to lead to a much better outcome. Hybrid is similar to this, except that I have a lot more sympathy in that no one is suggesting it is easy or trivial or even desired for companies to just hurl their data centers into the dumpster and move everything to public cloud. That's not feasible, it's not economical, and it's not a viable option for an awful lot of folks. The saddest hybrid deployments are, of course, people who decided to go all in on a cloud migration. So they go ahead and do it. They realize halfway through some things can't move. Like, that's a mainframe we have over there, and there is no AWS 400 yet. So we're going to give up halfway, plant a flag, declare victory, call it hybrid. It's not the best feeling in the world. My rant is over with a new question popping up. Oh, which is relevant to this. What do I think of companies considering eliminating an on-premise data center for all cloud? What are the risks going all public cloud with AWS or Azure for cloud only and disaster recovery? It varies from my perspective. I think that if you're going to go all in on a cloud provider and get rid of data centers, there are definite benefits to doing that. There's a whole class of problem you no longer have to think about. What does your equipment refresh cycle look like? You're transferring an awful lot of CapEx expenditure over to OpEx in most cases. You're looking now at a capability story. If I build an application and then don't touch it for a while, and I leave it in a cloud provider, 10 years later, I'm going to see better networking throughput, better durability, faster instances. Whereas if I try that in a data center, raccoons have carried off the data center into the forest right around year 2 or 3. So there's a maintenance burden that winds up getting removed. The economics of it are not necessarily as appalling as you might think. Talking to whatever cloud provider you go with and their account reps, there's a lot of custom programs that every provider out there has that will lead to advantageous pricing. I think that there's a whole class of problem you don't have to worry about anymore in an all cloud environment. Is it the right fit for everyone? Absolutely not. Is it the right fit for more companies than believe it's a fit for them? Certainly. And I've seen this done in regulated industries and a bunch of other areas too, where it just makes sense. Merritt, anything to add on that one? I know that there are always challenging to talk about should you go all in when you receive a paycheck from a cloud provider who would benefit from that, but please.
I mean, to be honest, so while I do work for AWS, like I am not here to, recite marketing talking points. I can tell you from my experience with customers that it is common for folks to still keep some assets on-prem, and especially if they're kind of going through that cultural transformation where they still have some server huggers, they may feel more comfortable, at least for a period of time, keeping some stuff on-prem, and that doesn't negate the economies of scale that you get, at least some of them. But I think that part of the value add, so there's a range of things that you might benefit from when you move to cloud from a security perspective. One is that visibility that we talked about, and that kind of granularity and the ability to deploy, to make decisions about your assets immediately, to deploy patches immediately, to have your provider doing a lot of the background maintenance for you. All of those things you gain even if you have not gone all in. However, you miss the ability to know, you would have visibility only on the stuff that you've put in AWS, right? And I certainly agree with you that, like, every time people say we're doing a hybrid cloud strategy with like multiple clouds, I feel the instinct to use the Princess Bride. I do not think that word means what you think it means. Like, that is not a strategy. That's fine if you've decided like you can figure out how to do that, but it's going to introduce complexity. The benefits that you get from going to cloud are diminished if you have to get your developers up on more than one platform. And also you miss out on the visibility of having it all in one place and the ability to deploy immediately and all those kinds of economies of scale, let alone the way that, as you point out, things are like technology is changing rapidly. We pride ourselves, while you are totally right to say that no AWS employee is an expert on every one of the more than 100 services. We pride ourselves on the pace of innovation and the fact that we're always pushing toward the horizon of emerging technologies. It is a value add to your org that you benefit from that kind of development cycle that we have internally. So anyway, so I think that I agree with your points. Actually, I would say the pick a provider and go all in, and that will be where you get the most returns.
Be careful. I agree with Corey. Is a career-limiting move in many places at Amazon.
Hey, Merritt and Corey, just one of the things you look at in the agenda, just two other points. This is Ron Gerber. Mm-hmm. I know Steve Woodard, who's part of the AWS team. He's speaking for about an hour this afternoon on two related subjects. One is on the AWS Security Hub, which ties in with some of the comments that Merritt and Corey made about the importance of centrally monitoring and automating the monitoring of threats, alerts, et cetera. So it's a key benefit of going all into AWS. At the same time, he's also going to talk about hybrid architecture, things like Outposts, which is AWS on-prem and other solutions, because as both Corey and Merritt indicated, there are lots of very compelling strategic financial benefits to going all in, but for any number of reasons, you may not be able to do it now. So when people go through this whole webinar, you've got great insights from multiple people. We'll have all the content available for downloading, and then each of you can then make informed decisions as to what's appropriate in your organizations. And it's great having experts like Steve and Merritt and Corey to help guide you through that journey. The other thing I just want to point out too is one of our sponsors is Clumio. We talked about the great advantage of doing cloud-based DR because no one ever wants to do disaster recovery testing. They say they're going to do it, but they never do it. And Clumio is a great...
We have a plan to disaster recovery testing, which makes you feel better about not doing disaster recovery testing.
Yeah. But there's companies like Clumio, who's a key sponsor and partner of AWS, who'll talk about once you do go all into AWS, they've got great solutions or hear about to help complement that AWS cloud-based DR and storage solutions. All right, let me turn it back over to Corey and Merritt.
Sure. We also have a question that has come in as well, which I really want to address because I like the idea of the question and its premise. Specifically, what's the risk of eliminating data? Isn't the risk of eliminating data center high since this is caused with COVID-19, all our manufacturing is in China and you don't have diversified manufacturing? Supply chain risk does become a challenge, but this is where the idea of threat modeling becomes important. What is your risk model that you're concerned about? Is it your cloud provider gets bored and shuts down the cloud and to go work on something else? Well, if you're picking Google Cloud, that's a viable going concern, and you probably should have a plan for when they decide to Google reader their cloud product. Other times, this is why vendor selection remains important. One of the benefits, though, is that there are so many companies who are tied inextricably to any given cloud provider that something like that is going to be telegraphed way, way, way in advance. Now, I would argue that for what I do, an awful lot of it is sufficient for me to have backups sufficient to rehydrate my architecture and environment with a total loss of everything AWS. That might be something that's worth doing. Understand that in that scenario, we're talking about an end of days story where nothing is going to be what we think it's going to be. But at least having the backups and another provider living somewhere else, possibly on premises, is the right answer for that. Other folks who are doing things that are life critical, that need to transcend the boundaries of everything, well, that becomes a viable story too, but I question whether an on-premises data center is necessarily the right story there. It comes down to what is your scenario modeling? What are you trying to guard against? And critically, how much is the business willing to invest in shoring that up? I was building an email system once, and great. What's your availability requirement? Oh, no downtime is acceptable. So 5 nines, okay, to start, great. That'll require at least $20 million to build out multiple data centers. When that runs out, we're going to go ahead and need more. Like, whoa, whoa, whoa. It turns out what they meant by no downtime was it would be nice if email worked during the business hours, most days. Oh, okay, now we're just having a negotiation back and forth. SLAs are always about negotiation. Understand what's important and what is critical. One thing I would caution people to do, though, is to avoid the trap of identifying with this environment that you have built. That's a fast track to irrelevance, where it's, I work on this technology, it's a technology I'm good at, and it's how I define myself. I started my career doing large-scale email systems administration. That's not really a job anymore outside of maybe a half dozen companies. So I was faced with a choice of, is it time for me to find a new area of specialty, or do I cling to this? My approach has been to embrace learning new things. If you don't want to learn new things every few years, I'm sorry to say, we've all picked the wrong profession. There aren't a whole lot of tracks where we can keep doing the same thing year over year to take us from mid-career to retirement, or from a new grad today into a position where they'd finally pivot away from individual contributor work into management in 15 years. The world is moving, and it's not slowing down anytime soon. Rant over.
Yeah. No, I like it. I think, so yeah, we are not, as you have noticed, as we talk, we are not here talking specifically about any one AWS service. We're here talking about just approaches in general. And I think being service agnostic and being even vendor agnostic is the right way to think about these issues. And then if you are spitballing how to deploy something specific on AWS, you'll hear from folks who are talking about specific services later today. You can look at, quick starts and CDKs and lots of ways to kind of get the ball rolling. But I think ultimately the technology then grounds a series of business decisions that we are speaking to today about just kind of the mentality and the approach that you want to take when you're working within cloud. One of the things that you have touched on a couple times, Corey, is the kind of the right tool for the right job, as we would say at Amazon. But I think, zero trust, for example, is a term that has been bounced around recently, and this is like nothing new conceptually, but part of this is you don't actually necessarily need every stopgap possible for everything that you do. However, you want to think through what makes sense and treat your, part of this is having, whether it's tags or just like more organically having a sense of your crown jewels and knowing your kind of data classification and your preferences overall in your industry and your threat vectors. But basically, thinking through what makes sense. But in a sophisticated world, we would expect that folks have both kind of traditional perimeter-based considerations, firewalls, et cetera, but also thinking through software-defined networking. Like, you should be thinking through the way that your controls operate. You should be taking advantage of things like formal methods where we use math to validate that you've done what you think you've done. We have a group called the Automated Reasoning Group at AWS. Again, this is a business differentiator if you are moving to cloud, because you're probably not going to have a bunch of math PhDs on staff who can verify that you've done what you think you've done with your networking. But now that, let's say, you have a CloudFormation template or Terraform or whatever, you've got your infrastructure as code, then you can do security as code, and then you can encode policies as logical formulas. So you can be really working on next level kind of technologies when you're in cloud, and it happens, it's accessible to you overnight without having to build that capability. So I think there's elements of just the approach itself taking on that, moving past the perimeter mentality, where your conception of what you're doing from a security point of view should be throughout your enterprise. But that doesn't mean that you just put everything in place to make it hard to do and then call it zero trust. That's not a good enough approach to allow your business to thrive.
We have another question as well that's entered into the chat. Specifically, James asks, are there any good examples of what should not be put in a cloud data center versus on premises? And my answer to that is no. It depends entirely on who you are and what your perspective is. I've talked to financial institutions now who are like, oh, our data is too sensitive to live in cloud. Really? Because the bank you do banking with has their stuff in cloud. Your government does, your regulator does, your tax authority does. So what makes your data so special? There are also capability stories, there's regulatory stories, and things that the cloud used to frankly suck at are no longer true. Well, if you need to do something that's incredibly I/O sensitive, latency is non-deterministic in the cloud, so you're going to want to run that on premises. Yeah, then it got a lot better. That's one of the neat parts. If you have a use case that's unique that does not work in the cloud, great. First, reach out to me because I'd love to hear it and maybe change this answer. Secondly, I would love to see that taken to a cloud provider. Here's this thing that sucks. One thing that I've always appreciated about the cloud providers is when you have a use case that doesn't fit in the cloud, they're very interested in understanding more about that use case and possibly changing the story. Things that 5 years ago, I would have had a radically different answer. All right, what shouldn't we put in the cloud? Like, I have a laundry list of these things. Like, anything that's latency sensitive, are you nuts? Why would you possibly put that in the cloud? Well, now I get way better latency from some of the things I have sitting up there than I do of things locally, because it turns out I suck at home networking.
Yeah, no, good point. And I think even from a compliance standpoint, let's say, we work with auditors and try to get them to understand, when I was talking about, for example, the automated reasoning group, you can do continuous compliance and you can show your auditor, like, we know this to be true if you believe in math, that these permissions are in place, or that we can point to any point in time that you can basically, rather than going out and trying to manually count how many of whatever you have or how many, there's a tool that we have called Tiros that it's part of Inspector now, that will, without sending a packet over the network, will tell you network reachability. So something like that, it allows you, instead of manually demonstrating to your auditor that things haven't gone through, you can demonstrate that there are no internet-facing endpoints, let's say, for example, which is a CIS benchmark requirement. So just knowing facts about your network instead of having to kind of test it and see what happens manually and kind of hope that your home networking went out the way that you had hoped. So there's, I think the cohesiveness of your story around cloud has also gotten stronger, and we are finding more and more ways for, like Corey said, if you have a story of something that you feel you can't put in cloud, we'd love to hear about that, because we are always trying to work on not just how to improve the durability and reliability and security of your assets that you're storing, but also how to tell that story to others. So how to get your auditors and your customers and your business, decision makers on board and have the right conversations. So, if that's a concern, those are conversations that we are absolutely open to. But I think that there's nothing that is inherently not able to move to cloud. And in fact, you probably will find, depending on what your business case is, you will find other avenues of interesting work that you can get done in cloud that you couldn't do on-prem. And certainly the ability to spin up and spin down and play around with some of the services that you can just take out of the box are things that you just could never do. Like when we kind of talk about on-prem versus cloud, that pretends like they have the same capabilities, which is not true. Corey, I have a question for you, which is, the flexibility of your cloud billing means that you're getting your bills, incrementally instead of at the end of the year, like some traditional enterprises we're used to. How do you advise folks who are, adjusting to that? How do they get their leadership to understand how that's going to work? And are there strategies to kind of mitigate their perceptions of concern there?
Yes, and it involves looping finance in sooner rather than later. This isn't cost accounting where you're trying to get accurate predictive models of everything. There's going to be a variance month to month. Make sure that makes sense. Understand that what aspects of your spend are controlled by whatever business metrics drive you. What is going to be a fixed sunk cost, regardless of user traffic, for example, is going to be something else to consider. And just make sure that you're on the same page so you don't surprise people. The last thing that anyone wants is a giant bill surprise. They want to understand what's happening. What's commonly misunderstood is the idea that, well, if the bill goes up, people are going to be angry in finance. Yeah, they are. But guess what? They're also going to be annoyed if it goes down suddenly and they didn't see it coming. They don't actually care if you're spending $1 million this month versus $5 million on the cloud. Their job is not to save money at all costs. It's to make sure that the business is healthy and that they're able to get business value for what they're spending money on. And being able to predict what that looks like is critically important for those folks. I think that there's a tremendous understanding gap between IT and finance in many cases.
Mm-hmm. All right, we're coming up on the hour. We had started a little early. Ron, did you want to, stay on the schedule that we had dictated, which was an hour for us?
Yeah, I had a couple of things. I don't know if you specifically covered it. But I'm just going to make a couple of quick comments. But James also wondered how solutions such as Cisco Voice over IP, how could that work within an AWS solution? Can that be moved to the cloud? So maybe
Sure.
Corey or Merritt, if you could answer that, that's one of the specific questions. Just in general, one of the things that I've seen from a lot of our live events, and I don't know if you specifically mentioned tools like Landing Zone. That's a good management console that a lot of people like hearing about, that helps you understand your AWS cost and account usage. Another thing where I think these tools are very relevant to look at your bills and look and see where things are being spent is that ties in with another security risks that come up. This is more at some of the live Angel Beat events about shadow IT, where different groups know about AWS account activities and other line of business teams, for all the best of intentions, may suddenly not only spend a lot of money on AWS as they're trying to analyze data. I know of one specific situation where the healthcare organization had an AWS account, wanted to analyze a lot of patient data, and they just weren't concerned with HIPAA security guidelines and compliance. And because they spun some information up in AWS to help analyze it for all the right reasons, they weren't aware of this, and only came to the attention of the security and compliance team and the financial team when they looked at their AWS bill, wondered what was going on, and they were able to avert a major HIPAA compliance breach by stopping that. So I just point that example out there to show that by looking at what's being spent and what's being used, it can give you insights and things you might not be aware of. So maybe just turning it back over to Corey and Merritt, if you could just again comment on Cisco Voice over IP, and maybe as we conclude this, maybe if each of you, with all of your background, maybe could leave the attendees with 2 or 3 specific takeaway actions that they should think about as they want to move forward.
Sure. Cisco themselves is coming with a better cloud story all the time. Secondly, I would consider a lot of the voice over IP stuff, depending on what you're doing, to be artifacts of what you have in an office that's on premises. I would hesitate to say that workloads that are to empower everyone in your building to work together are necessarily great candidates for moving to the cloud. That said, I also, 8 years ago or so, ran my own Asterisk box in the cloud, and that worked reasonably well for what I needed it to do, namely provide a voice conference line that wasn't terrible. And it can be done. The question comes down to what is your outcome and where are you starting from? If you have an existing sizable investment in your Cisco voice over IP system on-prem, yeah, you'd be silly to wind up looking at migrating that off. Counterpoint, if I'm building out something today that requires a lot of voice over IP services in the world of AWS, for example, I'd start by looking at Amazon Connect or one of the various partners that does a lot of custom work with voice over IP in cloud. It comes down to, a lot of what I'm talking about is the idea of a best practice direction I would go in. There's always going to be an exception where you've made, well, we already have considered this, and for our use case, it makes sense to be multi-cloud or have this hybrid thing or keep our data center for this workload. In those cases, I would say unhesitatingly, you're probably right. You have context I couldn't possibly have about your environment. I'm not coming at this from the position of a zealot. I'm coming at this from an idea of best practices and what I would look at as a sensible starting default position. By the time you have reason to deviate for it, validate that your reasons are sensible and talk to folks who have experience in the space. But yeah, again, it comes down to what's right for you and your company. I'm a talking head, and a very pretty one, I might add. But I can't tell you what's right for you and your environment and your constraints. It comes down to what needs to make sense for your business and the time that you're in and the investments you've made. Merritt, anything to add, counter?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say I'm not going to, aside from any one particular vendor product, the short answer is you can run almost anything on AWS. So if you are wedded to your Splunk dashboard or your whatever, I mean, like, you can run that on AWS. But as Ron pointed out, you know, we now have something called Security Hub that is that kind of aggregation of inputs. We have managed services like landing zones and AWS organizations that allow you to vend accounts and to do account management at scale with greater ease, hopefully. The point here, I think, is, and Corey and I have talked about this before, like, you know, it's easy for us to stand or sit in front of you and say these are best practices, and we recognize that it's hard to actually do some of this stuff. And I think that's where I come back to, this is a process-driven conversation. That being said, you know, usually I get in front of customers who are saying, you know, can I do this? Can I do that? And I say, what are you doing now? Is it working? Are you happy with, you know, the level that you kind of have de facto gotten to? You know, what's working and what isn't? And how do we have conversations about what it would look like for you to get returns from being in cloud? And I think that one of the elements here is just that the ability to automate yourself out of a job. So our CTO, Werner Vogels, often says, get the people away from the machines. You want to minimize that gray space where you require human decision-making. So putting in thresholds for kind of decisions that involve security. You can also have thresholds for billing. But automate wherever you can and start wherever, because I recognize that it's easier to lose 5 pounds than 30, if you will. That's an Eric Brandwein quote. Not literal, but, you know, start wherever and start automating, and you will, you know, solve big problems by solving small problems. Create a culture of automation, and you will really start to kind of unleash this potential. And from our perspective, you know, some of this becomes a service. So watch your flow logs for anomalies became guard duty, and you know, S3 openness became S3 block public access as a service. Like, we try to take some of these field realities and turn them into services so that we can make the secure thing the easiest thing to do. But ultimately, we recognize that these are process-driven conversations, and I think that when it comes to vendor conversations, if you have something you're wedded to, we have the broadest and deepest marketplace of partner network, so you can probably run it on AWS. And then the question would just be, you know, what value are you getting from that, and are you?
Novel idea. Talk to the partner and talk to the company in question. Vendor, I promise, it will not be the first time the vendor has heard, "Can we move this thing to the cloud?"
Yep, that's right.
The answer is no. Okay, great. That's a data point.
And look at what you're paying for already with that vendor, and are you getting value out of it, or are you using elements of it that you could be, or are you using it to the best effect? You know, one of the reasons that I think even though it seems like a little bit of an odd couple to have Corey and me on together, one of the reasons I liked the idea is that AWS is not actually trying to encourage folks to rack up unintentionally large bills. Like, the goal is to streamline what you're doing, to get bang for your buck, to have you doing the best. Your solutions architect will help you brainstorm how to keep costs managed. You should be happy with the value that you're getting from a security and a billing perspective. So there's no trick questions here. This is not a gotcha game where we're hoping to.
There's no one on the other side of what I do.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, we genuinely care about making sure our customers are happy with their billing and their security, and so this is a shared fate kind of conversation, and I think it should be. If we're in it for the long haul. So recognizing that there's ground truths that we are all human and these are processes. But at the end of the day, feel free, as I mentioned, to follow up. I think we are just about at time for today, but Corey and I actually will be on another speaking event later today. So check out my Twitter if you're interested in joining us again in a couple hours. Corey, any closing words?
I think that you've nailed it. And again, take all of these questions about whether you're getting value for what you're investing in a vendor. That your cloud provider is not exempted from that at all. You should be asking those questions, because if the answer is, wow, we spend them an awful lot of money and get nothing in return, great, dig into that. They want to hear that feedback in most cases. This is not a story of being tricked into signing contracts you're not going to be able to live up to. No one is happy with those stories. And the reason that the cloud has taken off is, in many cases, because customers are thrilled by what's happened. It makes sense. Not for all customers by a landslide, but for an awful lot of them, that's the case. So remember, the only people who really have your interests at heart, truly, is you. But reach out, ask on different axes. Understand that as you look at different aspects of a cloud story, there's going to be different specialties that need to be consulted. No one person is the expert on all of it. So the best thing you can ever say when having these conversations is, I don't know, but you have to finish that with, but I can find out.